Probably Wednesday it'll be winter again. No, actually it's supposed to be nice, isn't it? For a few days anyway. Defend the throne. If you recall, on Friday, we had just assassinated a president. Well, we didn't. A terrorist in Buffalo did. Shot and killed William McKinley. And in the words of Mark Hanna, oh my God, that damned cowboy is now president, end quote. Theodore Roosevelt's now in the presidency. And Hanna was right about one thing. Roosevelt is going to shake up the presidency. He's going to transform it. He's going to begin the process of turning it into the modern activist presidency. The one you folks grew up with, the one we're all familiar with today. The idea that the president is basically a vigorous leader, has their own agenda and vision for the nation, basically takes the bull by the horns, is a leader. Now, this is different than most previous presidents. Washington, when he assumed the presidency, established a precedent of a, quote, restrained or limited presidency. The idea that the president could only do what was specifically spelled out in the Constitution. If it doesn't say that, say it in black and white, the president couldn't do it. And that was the model through basically the next 100 and some odd years. Most presidents, with few exceptions, followed the limited presidency. You do have exceptions. Jefferson and Lincoln stand out. Both acted more like a modern activist president than a traditional 19th century one. Plus Polk and Lincoln, but they had wars to fight. So there were exceptions to it, but by and large, most presidents followed Washington's dictum of a limited presidency. Teddy Roosevelt's going to switch that around. He's going to basically start institutionalizing the idea of an activist president. He argues that presidential power was only limited by what the Constitution said they specifically could not do. If the Constitution doesn't prohibit it, then the president has a lot of leeway in that area. So he sort of flips it around. And by the way, this process of creating the modern activist presidency will be carried on by another progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, and then finalized under the administration of Franklin Roosevelt. So the creation of the modern presidency really takes a good 30 years, but it begins with Teddy Roosevelt. Now, who is this guy that's going to radically change the American presidency? Well, he was a member of a wealthy and well-established family. The Roosevelts had been in this country since the 1640s. By the way, what's his heritage? What's his ancestry? With a name like Roosevelt. Close. You're very close. Dutch. The double O gives it away. That's typical in a lot of Dutch names. And we've had a few other Dutch presidents of Dutch heritage. Martin Van Buren, Herbert Hoover, to name a couple. So the Roosevelts had been in this country for nearly 250 years when he assumed the presidency. The family had fought in the Revolution, and about the time of the Revolution, they split into two wings. Part of the family moved upstate New York. They became known as the Hyde Park Roosevelts, and Teddy's family stayed around New York City, and they became known as the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. The Oyster Bay Roosevelts became Republicans, as what Teddy was, and the other Roosevelts, the Hyde Park Roosevelts, eventually became Democrats and produced Franklin Roosevelt. Teddy's family lived in New York, but as I pointed out earlier, they owned ranches in the Southwest, and he frequently went to Europe. The family took frequent trips to Europe. So Teddy was just as comfortable sitting at a table with the Queen of England as he was sitting out west with a bunch of cowboys. He was well at home in both worlds. He was about 5'9", not a whole lot taller than I am, nearsighted with prominent buck teeth. And the political cartoonist had a field day with that. It was a lot of fun for them to caricature. And he had a high-pitched voice. One wonders how he'd sound on television today, for example. But he was very athletic. He loved to play tennis. Had a tennis court in the White House. And he'd invite foreign diplomats and senators and all that to play with him. And before his reputation got out, they'd try and take it easy on him. You don't want to beat the president, do you? He was murderous. He was a competitor. He'd beat the crap out of people on a tennis court. That was his nature. He was a hunter. He loved to box. He challenged people to boxing matches in the White House. How'd you like to be the ambassador to Great Britain? And here's the president say, hey, put the gloves on. Let's go a few rounds. By the way, it was all good natured. You know. But he was like that. He was just boisterous. He was outgoing. And despite his privileges, he had known adversity in life, helped shape him. He was a very sickly child, had severe asthma. It would bother him all his life, actually. One of the reasons the family kept sending him out west when he was younger was to try and improve his health. It seemed to work. And his first wife and his mother both die on the same day. His first wife died of kidney failure, and his mother of typhoid. And he was an imperialist, but he was willing to put his money where his mouth was. He does go to war in 1898, doesn't he? Doesn't send somebody else to do it. And by the way, he will eventually be awarded a Medal of Honor for his service in Cuba. It won't be till 2001 when he gets it. It's posthumous, as you might assume. But he does eventually get a Medal of Honor for it. For some reason, Congress likes to do stuff like that. 100 years after Robert E. Lee died, Congress voted to restore his citizenship. Here's Roosevelt as a Badlands hunter. And by the way, he was an excellent hunter and did know the Badlands. The ironic part is the picture was taken in a New York studio. By the way, how many of you folks had a teddy bear growing up? Oh, everybody did, right? Huh? You didn't?
I said I still do.
You still do? Oh, okay. You know how it got its name? Good guess, Teddy Roosevelt, yeah. He was out on a hunting trip, and somebody had killed the mother bear. And they brought the cub in chains and wanted to know if Teddy wanted to shoot it. And first they had to restrain Teddy from shooting them because he was outraged about that. But he refused to kill it, adopted it, and donated it to the Washington Zoo. It was extremely famous for years. And it became known as Teddy's bear. And some smart toy manufacturers, a German one, as a matter of fact, at first, caught on, thought, you know, this is a good marketing gimmick, and started marketing plush bears as Teddy's bears. And it really caught on. So that's why you guys grew up with a teddy bear. Didn't know that a president had anything to do with that, did you? And that was sort of his, especially for political cartoonists back then. See the little guy here? He shows up all the time in cartoons about Teddy. You'd think he really was followed around by a little bear. But. And by the way, you can also tell by not just his caricature, but the bear and all that, the press and the American public loved him. He was, you know, just one of those guys that everybody rooted for, as crazy as it could be sometimes. He was a lot like his public image. He was outgoing, he was optimistic, he was direct, he was incorruptible. He was money honest. You didn't see a taint of corruption around his administration. And he loved being the center of attention. His own son remarked that if TR, quote, were at a wedding, he'd want to be the bride, and if he was at a funeral, he'd want to be the corpse. He always wanted to be the center of attention. He even upstaged his own niece's wedding. That morning, he was Grand Marshal of the St. Patrick's Day Parade in New York, and that afternoon, he had the honor of giving away his favorite niece, Eleanor, to his extremely distant cousin, Franklin, in their marriage. Eleanor's father, Teddy's brother, had a lifelong problem with alcoholism and finally ended up killing him. So Teddy was more a father to Eleanor than her own father was. So in many ways it was fitting that he gave away the bride. But how many of you ladies would like to be upstaged by the president at your own wedding, right? And I always got a kick out of what he said to Franklin when he was congratulating him. He said, "Good job, son, you managed to keep the name in the family." Yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt gets married to Franklin and becomes Eleanor Roosevelt. When you would have had to change her driver's license if she had one back then. Now, TR does a lot to cultivate his public image, and again, that's a lot like a modern president, isn't it? Except, like some modern presidents, he was extremely friendly to the press. He understood the power of journalism and the need to communicate honestly with the American people. And the newspapers loved him. Doesn't mean Teddy didn't manipulate them occasionally. He understood the newspaper business. He understood newspaper deadlines. So he would often, if he wanted to make a big announcement, like the Pure Food and Drug Act or something, he would do it right before their deadline to get the copy in. So it would make like the evening newspaper, but they wouldn't have time to reflect on it or comment on it. But also they loved it because it gave them a big scoop at the last minute. So Teddy had a really good relationship with the press. He had a good rapport with the American public. Despite his wealth and privilege, he did have the common touch. He understood the average American. Even though, colloquially, in slang, the executive mansion, that was the official name of where the president lives in Washington, by then everybody was calling it the White House, but the official name was still the executive mansion. By executive order, it's Teddy Roosevelt that officially changes it to the White House. Sounds more American. Our president has always, hopefully, been, a person of the people. Don't you want them living in the White House, not the executive mansion? Or, thank God, a palace? He used the White House to communicate with the American public. He was dealing with a very conservative Congress. And Teddy's a reformer. He wants to enact progressive legislation. Congress isn't likely to do that without pressure. They were very conservative. Most of them hated him because he wanted to help the American public out. So he used the White House to appeal directly to you and you and you and you, to everybody. He called it his bully pulpit. And he used it to promote reform measures. Congress doesn't want to act. Teddy realized, he was one of the first to realize, you could use public pressure to get them to act. Whether they liked it or not, put enough pressure on them, they want to keep their jobs, a lot of them, they're going to act. And here's T.R. giving a speech. He loved it to talk. And by the way, he was brilliant. He was one of the presidents that basically had a genius level IQ. We've had quite a few. We've had a few morons too. Teddy wasn't one of them. So Teddy's going to have to use other methods to get around a conservative Congress to pass reform measures. One of them, as I pointed out, is this bully pulpit. The other is the use of the federal bureaucracy, the Justice Department, the federal court system. And he's going to use these to promote reform. And he's also going to use executive orders. Now, keep in mind, presidents cannot promulgate law, all right? An executive order is not a law. It has to be based on existing law. But having said that, it does give a president, as long as the framework's there, the legal framework is there, a lot of latitude. So Teddy's going to be the first president to really exploit the power of executive orders. He'll do it for good. A lot of his critics like to portray Teddy Roosevelt as a radical. And he really wasn't. He was a reformer, without a doubt. But he wasn't a radical. He accepted, and like all the progressives, he accepted and worked with the way America was. He didn't want to, revolutionize the political system. He wanted to clean it up. He didn't want to overthrow capitalism. He just wanted to reform it. So the progressives and Teddy Roosevelt weren't arguing for structural or fundamental change in the economic or political system. Just clean them up. He had a strong sense of fair play. And by the way, that was kind of reflective of the fact that he was an upper-class gentleman that grew up in the late 19th century. The British in particular, and back then it was becoming fashionable for us to copy anything British, we finally got over the fact we had fought 2 wars with them by then. But a lot of upper-class Americans adopted a lot of Victorian values. And many of these values were quite positive. And one of them was a sense of fair play, honesty, good sportsmanship. And Teddy really believed all that stuff. He believed life should be a level playing field. He believed things should be honest. And by the way, he wasn't naive. He realized it never would be totally, but he did realize he could do something to help. So he had this strong sense of fair play. And he wanted to use regulation, legal action, and public opinion to prevent abuses. And this was reflected in his campaign slogan in 1904. He offered the American people, quote, a square deal. That sound familiar? Can you think of another president that offered something similar? Another president named Roosevelt that offered? Yeah, Teddy had his square deal. His distant cousin Franklin, when he becomes president, has his New Deal. And he copied the term off the TRs. By the way, I wore my Teddy Roosevelt campaign button in today. Pass this around. This is actually a reproduction. I've got a whole bunch of real ones. I'm a historian. It's one of the geeky things I do. I collect campaign buttons, presidential buttons. But I'll be bringing some in. This is one of the earliest ones, actually. Not this button. This is reproduction, like I said. But modern campaign buttons only started like in the 1890s. So, and these are still kind of rare, the real ones. They don't look a whole lot different. But notice he's dressed like a Rough Rider on it. Might as well play up on that image, right? TR is going to be the first president to support the labor movement. Every other president since industrialization had supported business. If there was a strike, they were happy to send the army in to break it. Teddy Roosevelt is going to be different. He's going to side with the average working man. In May 1902, the United Mine Workers, under their legendary leader, John L. Mitchell, go on strike. They went on strike for better pay, shorter hours, safer conditions. And by the way, the mine owners back then were despots. They were horribly greedy individuals who didn't give a rat's patoot about the people that worked for them. There were several mine wars in West Virginia in this era, where the miners not only went on strike, they took up guns against the mining companies. How would you like to have to live in a mining town and not get paid in money, get paid in script by the company? And it was only good at the company store. Doesn't that sound almost like slavery, like servitude? And by the way, you couldn't pay your bills off with what they paid you, so you were always in debt to the company, which meant you couldn't quit, you couldn't leave. The mines were dangerous. They knew about certain things like black lung back then. They didn't care. So when the mine workers went on strike, it was for major issues, and it also, keep in mind, America was coal power back then. So this threatens industry, this threatens your ability to heat your home in the winter. Teddy, instead of doing what previous presidents had done, sending in the army to break the strike, he ordered the head of the United Mine Workers Union and the leaders of the the owners of the mines, to Washington, and said he was going to arbitrate a settlement. And you're going to have to live with it. And if the miners didn't like it, he would send the army, or the mine owners didn't like it, he would send the army in, not to break the strike, but to run the mines during the strike. So needless to say, the owners were happy to send representatives to Washington. And Teddy does arbitrate a fair end to the strike. The workers got a lot of what they wanted. Unfortunately, they did not yet get the right to federally recognized right to organize. But they got most of what they wanted, including safer conditions. That same year, Teddy will appoint Oliver Wendell Holmes to the Supreme Court. Oh, thank you. He appoints Holmes largely because of his pro-labor stance. And it also turns out to be a brilliant appointment. Holmes is now considered one of the greatest justices ever to sit on the Supreme Court. The progressives were concerned about safety and health in the workplace, especially that of women and children. And I want to point out up front, a lot of their concerns about women in the workplace had not as much to do with safety and more with sheer sexism. Progressives in New York had passed a state law restricting the number of hours a bakery worker could work. And again, it was a health issue. Well, in 1905, a conservative Supreme Court strikes it down. The case was Lochner versus New York. They said it was restraint of trade. If somebody wants to work 80 hours a week, that's their business. 3 years later, the Supreme Court, now influenced by Teddy's appointments, in Mueller versus Oregon, reverses its earlier ruling. Yes, the Supreme Court does that a lot, folks. they may have the last word, but they don't have the last word. Other Supreme Courts have overturned previous Supreme Court rulings. They uphold an Oregon law limiting women to a 10-hour workday in the laundry business, claiming that women's health is an object of public interest. So it was a step forward for safety in the workplace, but for very sexist reasons, quite frankly. Roosevelt was the first conservationist and environmentalist to be president. He truly loved the wild. He loved the outdoors. And even though he was an avid hunter, he also believed in conservation. So he's going to be the first president to actually be concerned about that issue and do something about it. In 1902, he gets Congress to pass the Newlands Reclamation Act. It funded irrigation projects on arid public lands, mostly out west, and it provides water to 10 million acres in 20 states. Which, by the way, was a good thing and was hailed at the time as a great conservation measure. And now, looking back, we see it as an environmental disaster because they built dams on every major river out west. And years later, a lot of the environmental damage is now apparent. So now they're dismantling a lot of the dams. So they did it with the best of intentions back then and to save the environment, and they ended up hurting the environment. But they were trying. And by executive order, he will add over 150 million acres to the national park and forest. And again, he just couldn't do this on his own. Congress had already passed a law allowing the president, under certain conditions, to set aside public lands for the benefit of the nation. So he was working within established law, but he adds tremendously to the number of national parks and forests we have today. Excuse me. He also establishes the National Park Forest. And I'm not sure if it has anything to do with him, but it wouldn't surprise me. But what's the mascot of the National Park Service?
The bear.
Yeah, Smokey the Bear. I wonder if that has anything to do with Teddy.
Maybe Slash.
Smokey the Bear?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. When was it? Yeah.
Actually, my grandfather was worked on forest fires, and he and the other man were the ones that found Smokey the Bear and raised it. My grandfather's like good friends then, and then when it like grew up, they took it to a zoo in Arizona. So.
Yeah, I heard the story. I forgot when it was.
Yeah.
That's
all
really
the other,
neat.
the mother bear and all the other cubs had died in a forest fire, and that one was clinging to a tree, and it was all burned, but they saved it.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. So it doesn't have anything to do with Teddy?
No.
Thank you. Cool. See, I learned something new today. Anyway, Teddy does establish a Forest Service, even if it has nothing to do with Smokey. And he names its first chief, Gifford Pinchot. And by the way, Pinchot will crop up in this class again down the road. When I talk about the Depression, he's going to be the Depression-era governor of Pennsylvania. But Pinchot, much like TR, is an ardent progressive. And much like TR, he's very combative. But it takes somebody like Pinchot to help save the forest from a lot of the lumbering industry back then. Back then, they were clear cutting thousands of miles of timber and not replanting it. So they're devastating entire areas, and then without the trees, you have mudslides and things like that. So, you know, they were destroying a lot of the environment up in Minnesota, Wisconsin, out in Oregon. Pinchot puts an end to a lot of that. Makes him one of the most hated men to the lumbering industry, but it's between him and Roosevelt that helped save a lot of the forest. And by the way, that's not an indictment of modern day lumbering companies, because they do a good job planting their own trees and replanting and things like that. But back then they weren't doing that. Oh, here's a different Pinchot. He just has that look in his eyes. You know he's somebody that's going to fight back. The progressives like TR, much like the earlier populists, had a profound distrust of corporate power and corporations. Back then, by the way, corporations were usually called trust, T-R-U-S-T. Unlike the populists, the progressives didn't want to destroy the corporations. They just wanted to regulate them and make them play fair. And TR realized that not all corporations were bad. In fact, he'd divide them up. He talked about good trust and bad trust. A good trust was one that benefited but did not dominate the market and was decent to its employees. And a bad trust was one that unfairly dominated the market and hurt the economy. He's going to start going after some of the worst abusers. In fact, he's going to earn the nickname the Trust Buster, not to be confused with a dust buster. But with him, it's nothing personal. Remember, he's wealthy as well. He knows Morgan. He knows Rockefeller. He goes to dinner parties with them. So it's nothing personal, but excuse me, I'm going to break your corporation. First one he went after was his friend J.P. Morgan's, his Northern Securities Holding Company. You know what a holding company is, right? It owns other companies. Berkshire Hathaway today, Buffett's company, is a modern day example of that. Doesn't really do anything except own other companies. Northern Securities, through hook or by crook, had gained control of almost the entire Eastern Railroad network. So they could set railroad rates at anything they wanted. They discriminated against rural customers, charged farmers and people living outside the cities a lot more, and then gave illegal rebates to a lot of the industrialists. So TR went after Northern Securities. He used the old anti-Sherman Trust Act, or Sherman Antitrust Act. He also used the so-called Hepburn Act, which gave the U.S. government the right to set railroad rates. But eventually he breaks up Northern Securities. And here's a cartoon of TR as a trust buster. And again, notice some of the themes in the cartoon. Dress like a Rough Rider and notice what's all around him. And here he is again. You didn't know the theme of today's class would be bears and history, did you? He also brings suit against two other large industrial trusts, American Tobacco and the so-called Sugar Trust. And in 1911, the government breaks up Rockefeller's empire. Standard Oil. They break it up into 34 companies. Now, the idea was to reestablish competition. The problem is, most of the oil companies, one, a lot of the bigger ones then swallow up the smaller ones, but they basically collude. They set up regional markets, which they can dominate. So on one hand, it's a step forward by breaking up Standard Oil. On the other hand, it doesn't change a whole lot in practice, at least at first. So there's only so far these reforms will go. And TR doesn't want to bust every trust in America. His administration only brings suit against about 40 companies, the worst abusers. All he's trying to do is send a message. Play fair, be honest, or this is what's going to happen to you. Ironically, his successor, William Howard Taft, from Cincinnati, actually TR busted 54, I'm sorry, I misquoted. Taft will bust 90. So again, TR, it's not like he's going after every corporation under the sun. He's just trying to send a message. And by the way, like every accidental president, TR wanted vindication. He wanted to be elected in his own right. And in 1904, he wins a pretty big victory. Back then, the South, much like it's pretty much solidly Republican today, back then it was solidly Democratic. So Roosevelt pretty much wins everything outside the South. And notice, we still have 3 states that aren't states yet. There were only 45 states in the Union back then. All 3 will be states very soon after this. Now, another major issue for the progressives was consumer protection. Keep in mind, before government regulation, it's amazing what companies would put in the food they sold to people, the adulterants. Baking companies often use sawdust or potato paste as filler. I don't know about you folks, but I'm not a termite. I don't need sawdust in my Wonder Bread. By the way, potato paste, it's basically a leftover product, and it has no nutritional value whatsoever. Sausage was sometimes made from rotten meat and might contain pieces of rat poison, insects, and other vermin. And popular patent medicines and cough remedies often contain alcohol, heroin, opium, cocaine. Coca-Cola back then still contained cocaine. It's the coca leaf that gives it its distinctive flavor, a little different from Pepsi. By the way, they now use decoconized coca leaves. But back then they used the real thing. When they said Coke picked you up, they meant it. But do you want your kids taking cough medicine made out of heroin? It'll do the job all right, won't it? Make a junkie out of Junior. And by the way, I may be a little lighthearted about it, unfortunately, but these things were, millions of women in particular were addicted to these patent back then. A lot of them were nothing more than opium and alcohol. Pick your poison. So before regulation, that's the kind of stuff that was getting foisted on the American public. By the way, I often say books can change history, and here's one that did. This is what led to reform in the meatpacking industry. Ironically, Sinclair was writing it to expose the plight of the immigrant worker, but he also exposed the filthy conditions in the meatpacking plants. And that's what ticked everybody off, shocked everybody. Teddy Roosevelt was allegedly reading this over breakfast and became so disgusted, that's when he decided to ask Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act. And Teddy was an avid reader. The idea of him reading this over breakfast isn't all that strange. Anyway, any of you folks ever read The Jungle? Yeah, I'm reading something. Oh, it's good, isn't it? Disturbing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Especially what happens in the immigrant families. And anyway, this is what I was talking about. Here's an ad for cocaine tooth drops. Instantaneous cure. I'm sure it was. And notice two happy kids playing. And they've had their jolt for the day already. Actually, dentists used to use cocaine as well. Works very effectively. The problem is some people have deadly allergies to it. Not only is it habit forming, but there's some people that if they just got a whiff of that, it would kill them. That's another problem with it. But yeah, used to have it in tooth drops. And speaking of what really goes into your food, this is a cartoon from back then. And it's probably hard for you guys to see, but there's dead animals, there's arsenic, there's garbage, all going into this, being sold as sweet-scented farm creamery butter. I guess today it would be sold as organic. Now that's one of those terms, it sounds great, and it'd be nice if everything was, but there are absolutely no government regulations determining what is organic. So they can put it on almost anything they want, unfortunately. Let's see, I think that's the last. Thought I had one for, also an ad for heroin cough drops for kids. Make baby sleep through the night. I'm sure it did. So anyway, Teddy pushes to get two extremely important laws passed. In 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act bans interstate transportation of adulterated or mislabeled food and drugs, and allows for federal inspection and fines for violators. And it also creates the modern Food and Drug Administration. And they also passed the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Meat must be slaughtered and packed under sanitary conditions. And it allows for government inspection and fine of companies that violate it. Now, despite what you might think, most of the larger corporations in America, especially the meat packers, strongly supported these laws. In fact, the big meat packers were firmly behind the Meat Inspection Act. You know why? They had already cleaned up their act. Had nothing to do with the U.S. government, had to do with the export market. The German Empire in the 1880s had passed purity laws. And they wouldn't allow in American meat products because they were too adulterated and tainted. And a lot of meat packers, especially the pork packers, were missing out on a huge market. So they wanted some sort of federal law to indicate that this food was, sanitary, edible. So the big packers actually supported it. The other reason they supported it, they knew the smaller packers couldn't afford the new measures to clean up their plants, and it would drive them out of business. So they backed a good law for basically their own corporate reasons. But you got to kind of thank Germany indirectly for having meat inspection here. Now, despite all of Roosevelt's accomplishments, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act are the only two significant pieces of progressive legislation he'll get passed. Everything else he does it, as I pointed out, either using federal bureaucracies, like the Justice Department or the Forestry Department, or through public pressure on Congress or executive order. It's going to be up to one of his successors, Woodrow Wilson, to get the progressive agenda enacted. As I'll demonstrate, Wilson understood the legislative system better than most presidents who've ever been in the White House. He had a friendlier Congress, and he had a knack for packaging things to get them to pass it. But Teddy does a lot to transform the presidency, but as far as a basic progressive agenda, he's stalled by a conservative Congress. Now, progressives in general were far more interested in domestic problems, with few exceptions. Teddy Roosevelt's one of the few progressives, and Woodrow Wilson will be another one, that have a keen interest in world affairs. Most progressives just wanted to concentrate on reforming the United States and making us an example for the rest of the world. TR is going to be different. He's going to be the first president to actually act like a great world leader. This is when we're going to emerge on the world stage as a major player. And we'll look at that on Wednesday.